Good morning and welcome again. Thanks for joining us for today's session on supporting students after a crisis. We are thrilled and thankful to have Brooke Lawson and Kyle Miller with us today. Brooke is from Carmel Clay Schools and Kyle is with Westfield Washington Schools, both kind of around the Indianapolis area. And they are both, I believe, prepared trainers, and I'm sure they'll tell you a little bit more maybe about themselves as they introduce themselves, and we will go ahead and get started. I did put the slides into the chat if you want to follow along. I'll add those back in again later if you joined us after the fact. And with that, Brooke and Kyle, if you want to go ahead and take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Amanda. Well, like Amanda said, my name is Brooke Lawson. I am the Director of Mental Health for Carmel Clay Schools. Kyle, you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Kyle Miller, Director of Student Support and Counseling Services for Westfield Washington Schools.
Yeah, and so I'm a school social worker by training, I, like Amanda said, I am also a prepare trainer, as Kyle is as well, and really started doing some of this work around crisis response after I had an experience supporting students and staff in a neighboring district after a school tragedy, and really felt like I needed a model or something to help me to know exactly what to do and how to support students in a crisis. So my screen is being a little crazy. Are the slides okay, Kyle?
Yep. Look
Awesome.
Good to me.
All right. Well, we would love to know who all of you are. So since we have a relatively large group, we'd love for you to put in the chat what your role is in your district, whether you're a teacher, a counselor, maybe a school social worker, school psychologist, maybe a school administrator, or even a district leader. Looks like we got a lot of school counselors, few school social workers, attendance officer, district leader. Perfect. Awesome. A principal, thanks for joining us. And then another quick thing before we get started, we'd love to hear from you a little bit about what you're hoping to learn from this session, or even what experiences you have with responding to crisis situations in your school community. I'll give you just a second. Awesome. Thanks, Beth. We will definitely go over some specific interventions that you can use within your schools. Great. Yep, Ashley, we're going to share my favorite prepare intervention today. So we'll talk, it's a resource I think that can be used in so many different areas of student support. All right, Kyle, well, I'll keep watching the chat, but I'm going to let you take it away.
Yeah, sure. And I'm with you who are looking for those specific interventions and strategies to use. So I'm going to kind of move through the first part of this pretty quickly so that we can spend the bulk of our time diving a little bit more deeply into our specific response and interventions that we provide for students and families and our teachers, because it is a comprehensive look at supporting kids during a crisis. But we all know it's important to be prepared. If you've ever been again, we've got some school leaders, some school counselors, district leaders. It is never a good thing when a crisis happens to sit down in front of a blank screen and begin thinking about what do we do? What message do we need to send to our teachers, our families, our community? And staring at a blank screen can be pretty difficult when you're already heightened in the moment when a crisis happens. So we know it's really important to be prepared, and it's also important because we serve a pretty vulnerable population, right? Our students. Those of us who have been doing this work for a while, we know all about the recent literature around childhood trauma, adverse childhood experiences, the impact that trauma can have on developing brains and coping strategies of our youth. And so it is super important to be prepared. So we go to that next slide, Brooke, we're going to talk a little bit about the prepare model, which Brooke and I have a lot of experience with as trained facilitators, but also one of the only that I'm aware of models that is specifically designed to provide crisis response and support to school environments. There are plenty of crisis response models out there. A lot of even the prepare model is based off of the Secret Service crisis response. But prepare really dove into what does it look like in a school setting and what are the different structures, processes, and supports that we need in the context of a school environment. We all know our schools are individual, they have their own cultures, they have their own climates. Um, whether you're rural or urban, there are just differences in schools. And so the prepare model is set up well to help provide support um, for that as we work through it. And also in partnership with our families. Each of our school communities are different. The needs of our school communities are different. And so prepare really does take into consideration all of those different factors. As I think our ultimate goal is that we partner with our parents, we partner with our school community to provide support in the aftermath of a crisis if and when those happen. And typically it's more when, unfortunately not if. And so being prepared is a super important part of that. So as we think about the type of crises that we face in schools, I'm wondering, and maybe in the chat you can tell me, are all crises the same? Do they have the same impact? Do they have the same response needed in each of these different things? So the ones that are listed on the screen are very broad categories, types of crises. So maybe in the chat, would you maybe take a venture? Which of those do you think has the potential to have the greatest psychological impact on kids? Which of those six do you think may have the most significant potential to have traumatic exposure and impact on kids? Which one? Violent death, somebody says. Anybody else? Amanda, was that you? Nicely done. Death in general. Hmm. I see death in general question mark. Always a good qualifier there. I'm with you. Violent death, if you had to pick, depends on the child. Yes, we're going to talk a lot about that. There is no one size fits all. So yeah, I think one of the things that we talk about as we think about the potential impact on the type of crises, those that are caused by people or they're intentional tend to have, in general, a greater potential for impact than those that are caused by nature or accidents that are non-fatal or natural disasters, right? There's a little bit of research that backs this up. I found it really interesting that students who experienced violent death or acts of war or terrorism, 30% of them went on to produce PTSD symptoms, right? Compared to only 5% of those that experience natural disasters or non-fatal illness or accidental injury. So the research does back up that those in the aftermath of a crisis, those experiencing clinical PTSD is a higher rate for those that experience exposure to violent death or acts of war or terrorism, and a little bit lower for those that have natural disasters. Now, I say all that in general because I think somebody says depends on the child and a lot of other factors. We're going to jump into some of those factors, but you're absolutely right. But I think in general, one of the ways that we begin this process is thinking about what crisis happened and what is the potential traumatic impact of that crisis. We know that some crises will have a greater impact than others. And so that begins to help frame our mind. So before we do anything, one of the things we're starting to think about is what is the potential impact of this crisis? Is it going to be huge or is it going to be small? And how do we then, and Brooke's going to talk about this too a little bit later, how do we then begin to determine which kids need which intervention and how do we triage that? So that's part of the work that we will do. But it's really, I think, important to just really stop and think about what type of crisis is this and what might be the potential impact for that. So when you have crises, you have also crisis reactions, right? These typical behaviors that we see in the aftermath of crises could be school adjustment difficulties. And this list that you see here could also be a list of things that you see in response to a variety of different things that are happening in a kid's life, right? Could be bullying, it could be mental illness, it could be a sickness or some sort of tragedy that they've gone through, right? So these school adjustment difficulties, behavior challenges, absenteeism, academic decline, poor performance, decreased verbal IQ, and the exacerbation of pre-existing difficulties, those are all typical responses of students who have been exposed to a crisis event. But again, could be a variety of different things, right? I think it's important to look at also the duration of these. I think that's an important piece. It is typical to see behavioral challenges or changes after a crisis event. But if you're 6 to 8 months later and you're still seeing that, it could be an indication that a further intervention might be needed. So another key important thing is to begin to think about what are the typical reactions and how typically, how long do those last? What is the duration of that? What is the intensity of those changes that you're beginning to see? That decreased verbal IQ, you could see that being a hyper arousal or a hypo arousal, right? Like some students respond in its overt behavior that you see. Some students will begin to withdraw or maybe not talk as much. So it's really important, number one, obviously, that we have good relationships with our kids and we know what their baseline is so that we can begin to identify if there are changes that have been made. So why do we do this work? The rationale for evaluating psychological trauma. I think we've already kind of touched on it, but traumatic events have different impacts or effects on different kids, right? Just like we do academically, when a student has experienced challenges or is having challenges with a specific topic, we typically don't do a one-size-fits-all intervention for every kid who has an academic challenge, right? We try to identify what specifically do they need and then put them into a targeted intervention that helps provide the support necessary to get them where we want to be. The same is true as we think about evaluating the psychological trauma after a crisis event. There is no one-size-fits-all intervention or thing that you do that will meet all of the needs of every one of our kids, right? Because they're all different. But we can operate from the lens that recovery is the norm, that when something happens that's a crisis event in our schools, we can expect after a certain amount of time that things do kind of return back to a new normal. I hate to use the word normal, but sometimes it's a new normal for them and they find a new rhythm. But recovery really is the norm. The key is finding the right intervention for the right kid at the right time. There are some exceptions to that recovery being the norm, particularly for kids that have pre-existing mental illness or pre-existing vulnerabilities, a trauma history that they've experienced. Maybe there's a death in the school and they are just experienced a death in their family, right? There's some pre-existing vulnerabilities that may impact that student more severely than a student who was in a different grade level or in a different area of the school and didn't really know the staff member or student who died. So we really have to be thinking about how do we begin to evaluate that psychological trauma. You can go on to the next one, Brooke. In As we evaluate that psychological trauma, one of the key mantras that I always have in my head is do no harm. How do we ensure that the interventions that we put in place don't cause unintended consequences or unintended harm? For example, if we do a one size fits all, we may say that we need to do some small group interventions for kids that were experienced or had exposure to this crisis. And in that small group intervention, we put kids who were right there when it happened, have a trauma story to tell, with kids who were not in physical close proximity to that event. And they begin to be traumatized by the stories of the students who begin to tell their story, right? So our rule is to do no harm, and again, to figure out what is the right intervention at the right time for the right kid, and how do we begin to identify that. And I think Brooke's going to really start to dive into how do we begin to evaluate and triage that.
Awesome. Thanks, Kyle. Yeah. So as we have said, there really is no one size fits all approach. And I know, prior to receiving the prepare training for me, when we would have crisis situations happen in our district, we'd say, we're just going to open the library and, everybody who needs to talk to an adult, just come down to the library. And while that is still something that we do because our schools are large, it's also really important for us to be really thoughtful and understand who are the students that are at most risk to struggle with the crisis situation that happens. So we're going to quickly review some of the risk factors that would indicate that a student might be more impacted by the crisis situation. So the first one is physical proximity to the crisis. So Kyle talked a little bit about how certainly we would not want to not necessarily over respond, but traumatize a student who didn't see the event and putting them in a group intervention with a student that did see the event. And so when we think about that first risk factor, we think about, were there students that were directly exposed to the event, that saw the event? And those are our students at most risk to experience traumatic stress from the event. And those students are probably students that would indicate we need to provide them with some type of support. Our next risk factor is emotional proximity to the crisis. So in our district, when a crisis happens, the first question I ask is, who saw this? And the second question I ask is, who are the students that were close to the victims? So thinking through, did this student that was impacted by the crisis have any siblings in our school or any relatives, or who were their best friends, or what were they a part of? So first risk factor is physical proximity. Our second risk factor is emotional proximity. So individuals that were close to the victims. And then as we think about further risk factors, we want to think about who are those students in our school that have some of the pre-trauma internal vulnerabilities. So Kyle talked earlier about how recovery is the norm for most students, except for students who are struggling with maybe a pre-existing mental illness or who have experienced a lot of traumatic events. And so as we look at this third risk factor, these are those students who you already know of, who you're already providing some type of support to within your school. And so that's kind of our third risk factor, are those students that come to school every day with some internal vulnerabilities that might need some additional support after a crisis situation occurs. Our fourth risk factor is pre-trauma external vulnerabilities. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the interventions that we might put in place after a crisis situation. And one of the first things is connecting the students back with their social support networks. So connecting them with their families, connecting them with their peers. And so if we have a student who we know lacks that family support and resources, they are a student that might be more likely to experience traumatic stress during a crisis situation. So thinking about those students who maybe don't have a lot of resources within their family, or maybe there's some poor family functioning going on, or they have a history of PTSD, or they're living in poverty. Those are some of our students who might be at more risk for struggling with the crisis situation. As well as students who don't have a lot of social resources. So We think about the family resources, and then we want to think about their social networks. So maybe we have a student who struggles with making friends or doesn't have a lot of social support at school or has even experienced some bias and discrimination. Those are students in our building that are our next risk factor group that might struggle with that traumatic event and could maybe benefit from support from our counselors or social workers. And then our last kind of risk factor that we think about is threat perceptions. And I love the visuals of these two girls on the ride, right? We've got one that looks extremely scared while the other one looks like she's having a great time. And so it's really, really important to remember that two people could experience the exact same situation and have completely different reactions to it. And so it's really a lot about that student's or that person's threat perception. And that perception is much more important than their exposure. So we could have a student who was in the physical proximity of the crisis situation, but they did not perceive to feel threatened by the situation. And so they may, once we check in with them, say they're doing all right and they don't need that additional support. And so it's important that we take that threat perception into consideration. It's also really important that we provide guidance to the adults who are supporting our students following a crisis situation, because their reactions can often influence children's threat perceptions. So I love Bruce Perry's one of my favorite authors and people that study the brain. And he talks a lot about how two people, like one child could be pulled from a burning building and not be traumatized by the situation, while another child could fall off their bike and be traumatized by the situation. And that could all be based on the adult reactions of the that are around that child and the way that they perceive the threatening situation. And so it is important that we provide some guidance and some coaching to the adults who are supporting the children through this crisis situation. And then lastly, I love this slide, and I think it can be really helpful as we are coaching even our adults around how they might support students. And it really illustrates the common crisis reactions that people might display following a crisis situation. So you'll see they kind of have them categorized here into 4 different areas: emotional, cognitive, physical, and behavioral. And while some of these may kind of coincide with different mental health issues, they all also are common crisis reactions. And so it's important that we don't pathologize these and say immediately, I know this child has developed a mental illness because they're experiencing these symptoms. And so it can be helpful, number one, to share this information with adults, but it can also be helpful to kind of normalize these crisis reactions with students and share with them, like, yeah, it's pretty common that after somebody has experienced something like you're experiencing, they might feel really sad, or they might feel worried, or they might feel fearful that this is going to happen again. And that is common. And so it's important to normalize that with students and adults to help them to understand these crisis reactions.
Okay, I promise that we're going to spend the last half hour diving into the crisis interventions and how we respond to the different needs that that our kids and our families and our teachers have when a crisis situation occurs. And so they're really in 3 broad categories. Social support, which Brooke just talked a little bit about, is probably the most common and I would say almost the most effective immediate intervention that you can put in place. Um, when we restore physical and psychological safety in the aftermath of a crisis event, it goes a long way. And one of the best ways to do that is to get kids and adults around other people that they feel love them and will support them and are there for them, right? There are some developmental things to think about. Like you probably all would be able to answer this. Elementary, their social support, most likely, where they're going to feel physically and psychologically safe is probably with adults. As we move into more adolescence, you guys know adolescents well. I saw some middle school people on here. Um, who are they going to want to be around in the aftermath of a crisis? Probably their peers, right? Like they want to be reunited with others that care for them. Um, we do this with adult supervision, but there is power in getting kids back together to reestablish that social support. The next one is psychological education. We're going to dive a little bit deeply into that today. And that is really around teaching kids how to cope. And we'll go through a couple ways in which we do that. And then the third, more intensive, more restrictive, more directive, is what we would call a psychological intervention, right? So all of these move from immediate, least restrictive social support all the way down to more restrictive and more directive around that psychological intervention. So let's jump into psychological education. Here's the definition. The provision of direct instruction and or the dissemination of information that helps crisis survivors and their caregivers in understanding, preparing for, and responding to the crisis event. Um, that's what psychological education does. It provides information, provides direct instruction in a more structured, intentional way to provide the resources necessary and hopefully um, at some point even teaching skills and helping kids understand what are those typical reactions in a crisis event. So that's the definition. And let's jump into what those strategies look like. And I'm going to kind of ping pong this back, Brooke, if you want to, of just giving our thoughts on these different ones. So the first one is what Prepare calls informational documents. As an administrator and as a district leader now, this is probably one of the first go-tos as we think about how will we inform, who will we inform, when will we inform of the crisis event. There are 100 factors that determine that, right? One of the things I've gathered from Prepare that I love the most is what Brooke talked about, that you have to work from the inside out. So as we think about who needs to be informed and what information do they need, we think about those that are most closely associated with the crisis event. So this could be individual, think elementary. This could be maybe a specific classroom. Maybe only one classroom was impacted. So do we really need to inform the other 3 fourth grade classrooms or the other 4 fourth grade classrooms of what's going on? Maybe, but maybe not. It depends on what the situation is. Maybe it's a situation where the entire grade level needs to be informed. Maybe it's a situation where the entire school needs to be informed. And then maybe as we continue to work out, maybe it's an entire district because the impact is so big. Those are the decisions that as administrators we're working through. Brooke, what would you add to informational documents?
Yeah, I was going to mention a couple more things. So I think that's so important that you are really thoughtful about who and how you're communicating this information to. Unfortunately, we aren't always the first ones to know because social media can be wonderful and terrible all at the same time, right? And so information sometimes gets posted before we get an opportunity to help communicate whatever it is that's going on, right? And we want to work with students' families to make sure that we have their support and all of those things. But I think one of the most 2 things I want to say about informational documents. One, the NASP website. So the Prepare model was created by the National Association of School Psychologists following Columbine. So a group of psychologists that kind of supported students and families following Columbine said, we need a model for schools on how to do this and how to support people. And so the National Association of School Psychologists website has amazing infographics for almost every situation that your school might struggle with that might be a crisis. And in a minute, while Kyle's talking, I'll see if I can pull a few of those up to share with you. But I love linking those in whatever information we're going to send out to families. They're a nice, quick guide and resource for families. So let's say we had a student pass away. And we will typically in that informational document We'll bullet out some information in there for families of here's what you can do to support your child, right? Because oftentimes we'll hear from parents who say, how do I talk to my child about this? What do I do to support them through this? How do I know if they're having a hard time? And so we'll bullet some information in that letter, but then we'll also link some resources and documents for families. And so I'll see. Oh, thanks, Kyle. There
That's
are
one.
some
You
really
may have some
wonderful
other
resources.
specific ones.
Yeah, there's some great resources on the NASP website that you can pull. I'd suggest when you have a moment when you're not busy and you're not in the midst of a crisis that you go through and kind of look through those resources and think about which ones might be helpful for you to keep on hand and in a folder. We also have already created a bunch of letters also to families so that we don't have to do it in the moment of crisis, so that we can pull from already written information and have that set for us to use. So those are great resources when it comes to informational documents. Kyle, you want me to take caregiver trainings?
I do.
I'd love to. So the next strategy that really is a tier 1 intervention following a crisis situation is caregiver trainings. And those can look like a variety of different types of meetings and conversations. But I always think the most common one for us in schools is a stand-up meeting with our staff members to let them know what's happened. So it doesn't always happen that we get the opportunity to hold a meeting before students arrive to tell all of our staff members what has happened and how we're going to support students throughout the day. But when we have that opportunity, we really want to take that opportunity to talk to the caregivers in our school community about what has happened, answer any questions that they might have, and then talk to them about how we're going to support students throughout the school day. So that's the most common caregiver training. I have in my experience had a few where we've met with parents and had some conversations with them about supporting their child following the crisis situation. In my previous district, we had a murder-suicide of 2 teachers. And one of those teachers taught a preschool classroom, the teacher that was murdered. And so we did have a caregiver training with all of the parents of the students in that classroom, where one of our crisis responders and our principal and the new teacher that was going to take over that classroom sat down with the families. These students were 3 and 4 years old, and their parents were like, how do I even explain? And what do I even say to my child about their new teacher and how they're going to have a new teacher and why they're going to have a new teacher? And is it appropriate for me to tell them what has happened? And so we met with all of the families and just gave advice and answered questions and talked about different ways that they can support their child through this transition. So there are times where, that a parent conversation is warranted, and having them come in and kind of talk through. That's a little more formal when you have parents come in, and not as immediate as a stand-up meeting with teachers, helping them understand how to support students.
And Brooke and I have both experienced these. And so if you want to reach out to us afterward, and our contact information will be available. If you want some examples of what a caregiver training agenda looks like and how to walk through that, like how would you facilitate a stand-up staff meeting prior to that? We have just some samples that we would be happy to share with you if you reach out to us individually. Mm-hmm. Let's move on to probably the most widely used intervention, which is a classroom meeting. So this can be part of your already established school-wide positive behavior intervention system, where you are maybe having morning meetings at the elementary level on a regular basis. Maybe that's how you start your day. Maybe, and you get a gold star, but maybe it's built into your master schedule that the first 15 minutes is a classroom meeting time where you have some community building, maybe you have some skill introduction and skill development that you're working on with kids. When it becomes a normal part of the school day where kids are just used to circling up or coming to the carpet or whatever it is, it makes this particular intervention just a little bit more comfortable, that it's not out of nowhere that our teacher sits us down and has a conversation with us. So on the preventative side, that's one thing to be thinking about. What does your tier 1 look like in terms of positive behavior interventions for kids? But if it's not part of the classroom meetings still work, right? They still are an opportunity for a classroom teacher to bring the class together, whether that's a middle school and you do it first period, or it's a middle school and you do it during your advisory period, or high school and it's advisory period. But an opportunity for teachers to do a couple things. Number one, share the information that you have as a school to help dispel rumors, to help give factual information of what event actually happened. And then also provide teachers the opportunity to begin what we call triage, right? Like which kids might need additional support after this classroom meeting. This is one intervention, a classroom meeting, where we introduce what happened. We give an opportunity for students to ask questions. Typically at the end of a classroom meeting, at least where I am, we will provide an opportunity for a kid to do some sort of debriefing activity, whether that's writing notes to the family, creating a card, writing about their favorite memory of maybe the person who had died or whatever the crisis situation is, an opportunity for them individually to process through what they might be thinking. So provide information in this classroom meeting. We're going to identify students who may need additional support or who may have lost emotional control when we begin talking about the crisis situation. An opportunity for them to process on their own, and then have them ask questions. In a classroom meeting, we're not really providing an opportunity for students to share their crisis story. Like a student who, again, maybe was in the neighborhood when the crisis happened and is sharing their firsthand experience of it with other kids who were not part of that. That's a consideration to make. And so we're going to kind of walk through, and Brooke's going to walk you through kind of what a classroom meeting could look like, a potential script that you could use, and then she'll add any other information around classroom meetings as well.
Perfect. So Kyle, do you want me to talk?
Oh yeah, you can do that part too.
Yeah, sure. So, these first three interventions are kind of what we would say is universal tier 1 interventions that you could do potentially with an entire school after a crisis has happened. The fourth one on here, student psychoeducational groups, is more of a selected intervention. It's more of an intervention that you might put in place after you have kind of had classroom meetings. Maybe you have a group of kids who are just really having a hard time. Maybe they have some of those risk factors that we talked about earlier, and they're just having a hard time coping. And so a student psychoeducational group is more of a tier 2 intervention where we've identified these students need a little more support, a little more conversation around how do I cope with this situation? What are some good coping strategies? And we know psychoeducation means to teach. And so a student psychoeducational group would be for maybe a smaller group of students who are just having a hard time kind of coping with whatever has happened. And NASP has a really wonderful curriculum for that. That you can take a look at. It's already created by developmental level of students. They have an elementary, intermediate grade level, middle school, and then high school psychoeducational group. And again, when you think about groups, right, in tier 2 interventions, this is certainly one of those crisis interventions that you would want to have a conversation with that student's parent, gain parental consent for them to participate. And the group would be it could be a group that meets for a couple of weeks. It could be a one-time group where you teach these students the strategies and then you move on. But it is a later kind of more restrictive intervention following a crisis situation. So Kyle kind of talked about some of the goals of the classroom meeting. And I think one of the most important things is that students have the knowledge of the factual crisis information. They understand what has happened, especially with our middle school kids and sometimes our high school kids as well. Like rumors start, right? It's human nature that if we don't have all the information about what is going on, we'll just fill it in with whatever we can kind of think about or find out or hear. And so having those classroom meetings really does give us an opportunity to kind of make sure that students understand the factual information. We have an opportunity to address rumors and say things to students like, Well, we don't know that to be true. The factual information about what is going on is this. And also, like Kyle said, it gives our teachers an opportunity to identify those students who might need a little bit more support. So as we think about, how I mentioned the old way of opening the library and all the kids coming down, while we still give that opportunity for students to self-identify that they need support, it also gives our teachers an opportunity to say, so-and-so had a lot of questions about what happened. So I think it might benefit them to talk to a counselor. Or so-and-so became really emotional during this conversation. So I think it might benefit them to talk to another adult. And in the ideal world with a crisis, which is never ideal, right? But in the world where we have the opportunity to find out this information before students arrive at school, we want to tell their families in that informational document the information. We want their parents to have that opportunity to have that conversation with them at home and tell them about what has happened. And then we're just going to follow up with that conversation at school. So typically in that informational document, you'll tell families, tomorrow we'll be talking as a class about what we've experienced and having a classroom meeting with students. And so we'll typically communicate that information to families. So this is just kind of a brief example of kind of how you'd set up a class meeting. So it's like you can see on here, it's pretty short. I'd say 15 minutes is stretching it. I'd say this takes no longer than about 10 minutes to have. And just like Kyle said, if you already have a morning meeting in place or you already have a community circle every day to start your morning, this is an easy place to just kind of put that conversation right in there. But we wanted to kind of share an example of what a classroom meeting script looks like. And in my district, when we hold a class meeting, we script the conversation for our teachers. So you are welcome to pull this exact script from these slides and edit it to make it what situation you're experiencing. And so I'll just go ahead and read it quickly so that you get an example of what a classroom meeting might sound like. As you know, another fourth grader in Mrs. Anderson's class, Nick Smith, died on Monday. What we know right now is that Nick passed away in his sleep sometime Sunday night, and we are unsure what caused this. We wanted to provide a chance for our class to talk together about how we're feeling. When something like this happens, people sometimes have questions, and I'd like to answer any questions that you have. I may or may not have all the answers, and I'll be honest with you if I don't know, or if we're not allowed to share specific information out of respect for Nick's family. I may also tell you to ask your parents, or I may have to go ask someone else and get back to you with more information. I also want to let you know that different people react to this type of event in different ways, and that's okay. Some people may cry, others may have trouble eating or sleeping. Some people may find it hard to do work, and others may have no reaction at all. Does anyone have any questions? So then the teacher or whoever is leading that meeting takes a moment to answer questions that the students might have. And then you end the meeting with, if you want to talk to somebody about your feelings or reactions regarding Nick's death, it's important to let us know, and we'll make sure you have the opportunity to talk to someone. We're giving students a chance to, so this was an example of a letter during COVID. So we gave students the opportunity to come to school or to meet virtually with a counselor. And then we ended it with, let me or your parent know if you want to talk more. So Kyle, I don't know if you have anything to add to the meeting script.
I was just thinking, like, this is the first step, right? And so if I'm a teacher in this classroom, number one, I've been provided a script that I can actually read. So that I don't have to stand in front of my 28 kids, 30, however many you have, and just make some things up. So it does provide a little structure for staff members to facilitate that conversation. I know the next slide, Brooke, you're going to talk about how to answer questions and some of the things to consider.
Yep.
But that I think is super helpful. The second piece, I think, from an administrative point of view, is also thinking about our staff members who were in close physical or emotional proximity to the situation. Remember our do no harm. And so there is a fine balance around allowing our students to see that we have emotions too, and that it's impacting us, and that's okay. And there's a difference between that and when a staff member or another adult loses emotional control. There may be staff members who are so severely impacted by this particular crisis, whatever it is, and they have lost emotional control. And so, one of the things from the administrative side is to always consider who might be able to step in for that teacher to facilitate that classroom meeting. The classroom teacher may not be in a space to be able to provide that. I was thinking about a crisis situation we had recently in one of our elementary schools. I, along with other counselors, had responded to the building to help provide support. And we had predetermined a person assigned to each of the 5 third-grade classrooms. If the teacher kind of tapped out and said, I can't do it, there was another adult ready to step right in, right? So that the teacher could do what she or he needed to do, and take care of themselves, which is super important. And there is no shame that you cannot facilitate that with your kids. Like, it's fine. But you have to have a plan in place to help support that. Does that make sense, Brooke?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And so this here is the second half of the script, where we're really just providing some follow-up for our staff members. So we only want to provide verified facts. So if you see right there at the top, we have the information that we have permission to share. The student died in their sleep Sunday night, and we're unsure what caused that death. It's important that we remind our staff too, that when we're talking about death, that we want to use, while it might feel really uncomfortable and awkward to use the words died, and it feels easier for us adults to say passed away or is gone. It's important that we avoid using those terms, because that can cause some misunderstanding. And so in this particular situation, when our student passed away in their sleep, it was really, really hard for the kids to understand, like, am I gonna go to sleep and never wake up? And so if you look down, so I'm kind of skipping around here, but on the third bullet, which it kind of talks about balance basic information with reassurance, about what we're doing to keep them safe, how these events are rare. And so typically I'll bullet some real specific information in there for our staff around the situation that occurred. So in this particular situation, I know we put information in there of, like, it's not common for someone to suddenly pass away in their sleep, and we don't know why this happened, but if we get more information, we'll share that information with you. Obviously respecting students' privacy and all of those things, but that's really hard for kids to make sense of. And so it's important to kind of script some language in there so that our teachers have that comfort level. We also have the second bullet in there is really kind of giving our teachers some ideas of how they might answer questions that might come up. So, a lot of times students are going to ask the same thing over and over again. And so you can continue to say, this is what we know, and share the factual information. If you don't have the answer, it's okay to say, I don't know. Or even to say, this is probably a really good conversation for you to have with your mom and dad. And guiding students to go back to their social supports and those family members in their life that can help support them. And so that's kind of the second half of the script. We can also provide a sample script to all of you so that you have that in your hands. And I think just lastly, another kind of helpful thing is that these class meetings and talking points can be used for a variety of situations. And I know, like, when we've had situations happen in our district, I'll sometimes develop a class meeting for the administrator to have on hand and share with teachers in the event that conversation comes up in the classroom and they're not sure how to handle it. So just for example, in my previous district, we had a situation where there was a younger child that had drowned in a retention pond right as our buses were letting students off for the end of the day. And so some of them saw a lot of the crisis responders, and we were concerned that it might come up the next day at school. And so we wanted to make sure that, number one, our teachers had the information about the community event that happened, right? And we wanted them to be prepared for the conversation should it come up in their classroom. We knew a whole bus of kids got off and saw that. And so we just provided the factual information that we knew about the event, and then gave the teachers some talking points in the event that students had questions or that it came up in conversation. So that can be another just kind of helpful way. Kyle, I don't know if you have any other thoughts or things
No, I
that you
think
might share around that.
yeah, classroom meetings can be used for a variety of different things. It doesn't have to be, always a huge, big crisis. It can be just something that's happening in your own classroom, right? Like, we need to have a classroom meeting about what just happened, right? Whether it was a huge disagreement, or maybe there was a student who was some challenging behavior and the classroom had to be evacuated, or those types of things. You can always bring kids back in and talk through that and help them understand what their experience was, and walk them through that. So classroom meetings is an intervention that can be used in so many different ways. I was also thinking, as you were talking, Brooke, around kids that I've worked with talk a lot, like they're always wanting, to your point of like, can this happen to me? Like if it's a car accident or somebody dying. And so ensuring that we're not lying to them, like it actually could. So we talk with teachers and give them talking points around, you know what, it is incredibly rare that something like this happens. It does happen, but all of the safety things, like you wear a safety belt and, all the things that we have in place to keep you safe. We think about, like in school, we talk about, that's why we lock our doors. This is like, so we always try to reframe the conversation back to, we don't say it can't happen, but we talk about how incredibly rare that is, and then talk about all the safety things that we have in place to help protect them and help keep them safe. And so a really good way to pivot that conversation. And then I also love the one Brooke mentioned too, of it's always good. That's a good one to go home and talk with mom and dad about. We don't want to get into any type of philosophical, religious conversation. We understand that each family has their own way of kind of viewing those things, and we want to honor that and respect that. And so one of the ways we do that is to say, it's a great thing to go back and talk with your family about, and move in that direction. All right, I see we got about 4 minutes left.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So we would love to, I'm going to actually stop sharing if that's okay with you, Amanda. And just see if there's any questions. I love to be able to see my screen, and I haven't been able to this entire presentation. So, are there questions, comments, concerns, other things that Kyle and I can help support you in? You can unmute, you can put it in the chat.
We have incredible wait time.
I was just getting ready to say that. Yeah, I'm a therapist too, so I'm good at wait time. But I do know that Amanda has a couple of announcements, so I want to offer that opportunity for her to share those things.
Thank you, Brooke and Kyle. So important to have this information. We hope we never have to use any of this, but as we know, in reality, at some point there will be, of course, a crisis. So this is very, very helpful. Also do want to share, we're looking into maybe offering some prepare trainings during second semester. We haven't scheduled those yet, but certainly once we do, we will include that in our monthly Counselor Connect newsletter. So if you have any interest in that, then keep an eye out for that after the new year, and maybe we'll have some more information to share. I know the state Department of Ed sometimes offers some as well. So I will look into that and see if those are, others are already scheduled, and share that information if it's available. I dropped into the chat the PGP. If you want a PGP for your attendance today, there's just a very short evaluation form you can fill out to get that. We are expanding our offer for free membership for Starling Minds. It has been available since February to licensed Indiana school counselors. We're happy to report that we are going to also be offering that to licensed school social workers, and that is through June of 2026. So this is a great online platform available to not only school social workers and counselors, but also to their family members. I believe it's ages 16 and up can also access this information. So check that out. There's a short video to describe that a little bit more in case you want to learn more before signing up for that free account. Some upcoming events we have. Next week, we have a spotlight on legal permission around student counseling assessments and screeners. If you want to join us for that free event. And then in January, we have several things happening. Coffee talk with diploma changes. Flora Jones is going to be sharing an update there. And we're doing a winter book study starting January 29th. We will be reading The Anxious Generation. So please join us if you're interested in reading that. And then finally, some resources and contact information. I'm going to zoom right through since we're right up against our time here. So thank you for being here. Thank you again, Brooke and Kyle. And reach out with questions. I'll share a follow-up email with some of the resources shared today as well. And otherwise, have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.